Hello, I'm Andy Schmuckler, author of a website and a video series called A Better Human Story. In one case, abetterhumanstory.org. People have been trying to understand evil in a whole variety of ways, from Luther's "and still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe," to the shadow on radio. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. I've read what I've been able to get my hands on these last 60 years on the subject of evil. And the reason being that I have based my work on around an understanding of something that happened to our species that unleashed a destructive force. And I believe that I have something to offer. I believe that if there's a contest about what's the best way of understanding evil, judged according to a whole variety of criteria of clarity, logic, comprehensiveness, a theory of evil that explains how it operates, what it is, and also what the origins of it are. I've watched the theologians struggle with the idea that there's this omnipotent and omniscient God who's also all good, so he can see everything in the future and he can accomplish whatever he wants to accomplish, and yet there is evil. And people have struggled to square that circle. They come up with inventions of free will. They're just waving a hand at the failure to reconcile what is actually irreconcilable. But anyway, I'm a social scientist or a social theorist or a theorist of history, or however. Some people have described me as a comprehensivist because I try to see things whole. And I've been looking at evil from a variety of angles. Like that book is the foundational idea of my whole life about what happens when a creature steps onto the path of civilization. We're the only ones that ever did that. And I say there are certain things that were inevitable after that. And it was originally my doctoral dissertation. I was invited to go to Berkeley and deliver a public lecture in lieu of a defense of it. And I worked so hard to do it as well as I could. And I wrote something which I called The Riddle of Evil. That was 1977. In 1991, I published a book whose subtitle was The Cycling of Good and Evil in the Human System. But then in 2004, I saw something that really had an impact on me about what was taking over the Republican Party. And it led me into thinking altogether anew at a deeper level, struggling with the idea of evil. And I want to present to you what I've come up with, which I think really fills the bill. First of all, I define it as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse or to make the human world more broken. I don't want to have to get into defining that, but I hope you can sort of envision what that means. A coherent force that, that there's something you can call there's an it there. There's a something that exists in the world that can be seen as being part of the picture, and that's having an impact on the world, and that impact is consistently to take things from the better toward the worse. Now, if you could establish that there was such a thing, I hope that you would agree that it would be reasonable to call that thing evil because it acts the way we've traditionally, in the religious traditions, understood evil. Mine is not going to be supernatural like Luther's ancient foe. It's going to be a way that the system inevitably unfolds to create a coherent force. So to skip a little bit, what I think I proved, that we get to the point where the emergence of civilization can be shown to lead inevitably to what you might describe as a war of all against all, or an anarchic situation where there is no order to control, regulate how the various components will interact. The components in this case being civilized societies that have left the natural order and gone into a disorder. So when you go into that disorder, you end up with a war of all against all. And that means that of all the cultural options that different civilizing societies might be developing, only those that can survive a war of all against all, who can prevail in such a war, which is not a random cross-section of will survive and spread. It leads inevitably to the selection in a very evolutionary kind of sense, but not biological. The selection in this anarchic situation of the ways of power that the creature seems to enter into a situation where it can invent its own way of life. That's the path of civilization. But it turns out it doesn't really have control over what direction things are going to go. That I think I can prove. Okay, so out of that anarchy, the ways of power being selected for, the war of all against all, mean that people are going through a lot of traumatic experience. First of all, the war of all against all is bound to make for a lot of unpleasant experiences that people hardly can ever recover from, watching their family put to the sword or whatever the deal is. And then the selection for power means that it's not random which ones get to survive and spread. When you have generation after generation, century after century of this selective process, you find out that you are putting a disproportionate amount of say in the hands of people who are basically gangsters. So that's the emergence of a force of brokenness. You can see that the brokenness of there being no order in the system inevitably creates a force that breaks people. And that leads to, if you want to investigate further, which I was led to. I mean, I wrote a whole book about that part called Out of Weakness, which is back healing the wounds that drive us to war. The wounded keep inflicting wounds. But in addition to the trauma of having to live in a world like it's described in the Bible. I mean, that's what like 2 to 4,000 years ago. The nature of civilization is shown there. It's pretty grim in a lot of ways. And, it didn't just start with biblical times. Time you have cities and empires and slaves, and chronic warfare. This is, I say, prove, according to my satisfaction, the inevitable result of stepping into the path of civilization. And if it can be shown that it inevitably leads to a coherent force that consistently works to make things more broken, then you can say that a force in the world of a creature that steps onto the path of civilization and heads in this power maximizing direction, that force which resembles evil, except that it's not supernatural at all. It's just an inevitable consequence of the breakout into of the ecologically evolved order. It means that there's an inevitable force in the world of the creature that creates civilization that warrants being called evil because it acts like evil. Now, I say a coherent force. I said if it could be shown that there was and that's sort of the next task. Now, I like to talk about the connections that are visible in the world of cause and effect. The systemic force operates through cause and effect. And I think you can visualize that by considering these two questions. Well, let's say there's also a force of wholeness, so like the good, but let's just stick with evil, which is our topic. We could identify any broken thing in the world. It could be an injustice. It could be hatred. It could be conflict instead of peace. Something broken. Something that, if it were the opposite, it would be a whole lot better human world, like love instead of hate, justice instead of injustice, peace instead of war. The ideal versus the shattering and destruction of that value. Creature is going to have a coherent force to contend with. And the way to make that coherence clear through the network of causes and effects is to take any single piece of brokenness and ask, what are the causes of its being this way? What are the things that led over time to it becoming this injustice or this hatred rather than some alternative? And I believe, and this I don't claim to have proven. I mean, I do a lot of specifics that make it plausible, but I haven't systematically proven that when you look at the causes of what's broken, you find other things that were broken. War can lead to trauma, and it leads to injustice, and those things. Then you look at the effects of each thing that are broken. This thing that's the result, it's the consequence of all this other brokenness that preceded it, that brought it into existence, then leads to the world developing, moving in what directions? I think what you'll find is that brokenness begets brokenness. But the causes and the consequences of each thing tend to be either more whole or more broken. And so you got these two coherent forces, inevitably. If you are willing to consider how brokenness begets brokenness in the realm of cause and effect, means that there can be seen to be a coherent force. It begets brokenness in different forms. So there is a shape-shifting thing going on where you have child rearing practices that lead to political behavior, that lead to injustices in a society. Thinking about some of the racism that we can discern in American history. The various levels move from one to another. Thomas Jefferson talked about how having slaves corrupted a person's character in despotic directions. Oh, well, that institution then feeds a kind of spirit of the gangster in a way that helped to precipitate the American Civil War. You can just see these things moving if you keep on looking at what are the causes and what are the effects. So what I'm suggesting then can be summarized. Any creature that steps onto the path of civilization will enter into a disordered situation that systemically generates a force of brokenness. And this thing moves through the human world through causes and effects as brokenness begets brokenness. And a force should be understood as that which moves things. So we're talking about a shape-shifting thing called brokenness that is one form in one case and then has ramifications. And it's the product of others, and that's how it works. And you can see this thing moving through history. And I like to say about that thing that you can see it the way you can see the wind in the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. If you look at how brokenness begets brokenness now, like in the Trump world, and you can see the things that have come together in the form of white supremacy and corporate greed and a variety of other things, like a certain kind of religiosity that all have become allied to constitute a force of fascism. You can see that there's a confluence of things and that certain historical crises can be understood as what happens when the brokenness begets brokenness all comes together into a single actor. And those are the crises that we faced, for example, in the 1930s and 40s into the 40s, where a whole powerful nation got taken over by a force that had roots in German child rearing practices, that had roots in Prussian militarism, had roots in German anti-Semitism, that brought them all together and had the vengeful impulse of a master race that had been felt humiliated in its history and was determined to show that it was number one. Deutschland über alles, a confluence of forces. So things like that, which I call the pure case, when a whole actor can be taken over by many different dimensions of brokenness, so that you get to the point where, amazingly to me, today's Republican Party has become something with which, if I were asked to make a list of things where the Republicans' effect on how things unfolded was to improve things, and when what the Republicans were saying had the effect of making things in the climate of our nation's power system better rather than worse, it's reached the point where I really don't know quite what I can put on that list. I've been saying for a long time that the best way of understanding the nature of the political battle in America today is that it has gone down to that level. A political side that seems in every battle to be fighting to make things worse is facing another political side, which necessarily, since it's fighting at something that's consistently working to make things worse, is having to fight to make things better, to deal with climate change, to include the rule of law, to ameliorate some of the inequalities. The list just goes on and on. And it's very consistent. I mean, it's hard to find a single issue, really, on which you say, well, on this one, the Democrats are pointing in a destructive direction and the Republicans are pointing in a constructive one. That used to be how it was in an American two-party system in the America I grew up in. But it stopped being that way. It was somewhat gradual, but by the time we get to Donald Trump, it really has become, and actually before that. And we are endangered right now because too many people on the side of American democracy, on the side of the good, that which takes the positions that make the world better, like the rule of law, like racial harmony, like on and on the list goes. That side needs to recognize what they're up against. And it's been taken a very long time to get to that point. And in fact, widespread enough yet. But for 20 years, the need to conceive of there being something that had been taken over by a force of brokenness. I have a way of explaining that. It's got to do with what happened when the Democratic South became the Republican South in the wake of the signing of the civil rights legislation by the Democrats. That just imbalanced the Republican Party. But it is important to see that there are forces here at work, that what we're up against at this late date is a fairly pure case that history only occasionally gives us. A force that should be understood as essentially an extension of evil in the human world, an expression of the force of evil in the human world. No wonder it's so naturally allied with Putin, and it was willing to block aid to Ukraine in order to help Putin resist humiliation at the hands of the Ukrainians. The political battle in America is not at the level of issues, really, so much. I mean, even the issues that we've got, like Ukraine or abortion or something like that, ultimately, in this situation, boil down to two coherent forces, one of which is consistently working toward making things more whole in the human world, and another which is consistently working to make things more broken. We used to have politics over issues. Now we've dropped down to the most fundamental level. Wholeness versus brokenness. Good versus evil. That is the central way of understanding our current political battle. And the secular worldview, I hope, can try on what I've just tried to show about the reality of something worth calling evil and fighting against as if evil is how we understood it to be. If that recognition had been there sooner, we wouldn't be on the brink right now. According to futures markets, fascism, which aligns very well with evil, has a decent chance of handing the powers of the presidency to Donald Trump, perhaps marking the end of American democracy. A battle of good versus evil, I'll say. Thank you. Bye-bye.